Good morning, this is Nikki Going. Today I'm going to be discussing Prayer to Masks by Léopold Senghor. I am from Enhanced Language Services and I will be offering a number of recordings on the matric poems on this channel, as well as other topics that are to do with English language. So please, if you found this presentation useful, like it, subscribe it, share the link, tell your friends about it, because the aim of this channel is to give matrics in South Africa as much help as possible and, of course, free of charge. As I said, today we will be discussing Léopold Senghor's poem, Prayer to Masks. Now, this is an African poem, and it doesn't fall squarely into any particular category, but I think as we discuss, you will find that it has elements of an elegy, a protest poem, and a praise poem. And as we go through the poem, I'd like you to think about which of these categories it fits into and whether it entirely fits into any of them or perhaps all of them. Enjoy. Poem exceptionally difficult, but I think if you understand the background, it gets a lot easier. Remember that Senghor's history and views cannot be separated from the history of French West Africa. French West Africa was a French colony in West Africa where Senghor was born in 1906. It had been controlled and conquered by various countries, including the British, Portuguese, Dutch, and French, and had been colonized for over 300 years. The French eventually took complete control in the 19th century, and they mined the country's gold reserves and experimented with growing cotton. Many of Senghor's people were enslaved and shipped to Europe and the Americas and had been since the 1600s. Resources from their colonies and free labor provided by slavery had allowed European countries and parts of the America to develop very powerful economies, and Senghor comments on this later in the poem. As a highly intelligent young man, he was given a scholarship to study in Paris, where he saw the huge influence of African art and culture on Western art and culture, particularly Western painting and music. And he eventually became a professor of African languages and civilization in France. In 1939, Senghor was conscripted into the French army and had to fight in World War II. He was captured by the Nazis in 1940 and spent 2 years in a Nazi prison camp, which led to his belief that the supposedly civilized Western nations weren't actually particularly civilized. He wrote some of his best poetry while he was a prisoner of war, and Prayer to Masks was published in a volume called Songs of Shadow in 1945. So that was just after World War II, after he had been released from this Nazi prison camp. And you can see how the full horror of man's inhumanity to man had informed his writing of the poem. Now, you're never going to be tested on all these dates and details in an exam, but I think if you understand Senghor's background and where he was coming from, the poem becomes really interesting and much, much easier to talk about. So enjoy. Senghor played a vital role in the government of French West Africa, where he had been born. He wanted to encourage African countries to cooperate rather than to compete with one another, and he encouraged the French government and the French West African government to form the Mali Foundation, which involved French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, French Sudan, Dahomey, and Upper Volta, all areas that were renamed after they gained independence, working together for self-rule and, very importantly, for African solutions to African challenges. The foundation didn't last long, but Senghor always encouraged cooperation between Africans and African nations. He kept working with the French government and constantly petitioned and worked with them to arrange for the granting of independence to French West Africa. And eventually the country became independent on the 4th of April 1960, when it was renamed Senegal. Senghor was unanimously elected as the country's first president and was then re-elected in 1963. And he was the first African president to voluntarily retire, which he did in 1980. While he was president, Senghor worked very hard to modernize Senegal and to make the country as democratic as possible. He was an internationally acknowledged poet. He was an African socialist, and he worked to create a government that would address the unique needs of Africans and that provided for the basic needs of all Senegalese people, regardless of their socioeconomic background. He was also very critical of the way that developed countries treated their former colonies, particularly as many of those developed countries had become wealthy because of their former colonies and because of slavery. And he felt that the economic relationships they established were particularly unfair. African countries were often forced into exploitative trade deals, and they had very little power on the world stage, which is something he also discusses in his poem. And if you're wondering why or how that's relevant, just think about the situation that most African countries, including South Africa, found themselves in today. Senghor proposed a philosophy that he called negritude, a movement that emphasized African values and heritage, and very importantly, the beauty of African culture. And as you can see from those pictures on the right, African culture had a huge influence on Western culture. The top image is a mask from West Africa, and the bottom is a painting by Pablo Picasso, one of the West's most influential artists. And Picasso and many other Western artists were huge admirers and very much influenced by African art. And you can see that influence when you compare the two pictures. Because of Senghor's influence and his admiration of African arts and culture, he arranged for Senegal to hold the World Festival of Negro Arts in 1966. Please note that at the time, Negro had none of the negative connotations that it has today. You need to remember that he was a complicated man. He was a Roman Catholic, a devout Roman Catholic, but he had a real respect for African traditional religion. He ruled over a largely Muslim population, but was very, very popular with them, despite the fact that he had a different religion. And he was French educated and an academic, but governed a very, very rural and largely illiterate population, which he worked very hard with to bring about far better rates of education and literacy in Senegal during his rule. As you read through Senghor's poem, you can see the tension between European and African influences on him and on Africa. Senghor appreciated Western art and culture, but he always taught that we must learn to absorb and influence others far more than they absorb and influence us. And you can see the important comment he's making about cultural appropriation long before that was a currently discussed issue. After his presidency, Senghor retired to live in France and to continue to write poetry, and he died in 2001. He was one of Africa's most admired and influential and very well-respected presidents. So some themes and ideas in the poem. The poem refers to traditional African religious beliefs, particularly a reverence for ancestors and the use of masks as a way of interacting with the ancestors and the spiritual world. The use of masks is very typical to traditional African religion in North Africa and particularly in Senegal. And although the poem is written by the first president of Senegal, Léopold Senghor, Senghor isn't only writing about Senegal. He's writing about post-colonial Africa and the contribution that African countries can make to a troubled world, particularly a world where so-called first world or developed countries have plunged the whole world into 2 world wars and a Cold War that have cost millions and millions of lives. So please note that this is not a protest poem set in South Africa or during apartheid. It doesn't specifically mention South Africa. It doesn't even specifically mention Senegal, although the religious traditions referenced are Senegalese. So please do not use the words apartheid in your discussions of this poem. Right, some more about masks and ancestors. So honoring one's ancestors is a very, very important aspect of many traditional African religious practices. Note that in African traditional religion, ancestors are honored. They're not worshipped. So they are seen in much the same way as Christians see saints. You can ask your ancestors to intercede with God or the gods to help you and other people on earth. And very importantly, the ancestors are regarded as part of the human community, and they are regarded as the most respected elders in the community, even though they are the spirits of the dead and are seen as living in the afterlife. So if you're thinking about this in terms of Ubuntu, I am a person because of other people. The other people include the ancestors as well. In countries where masks are carved, they can be used as a way of communicating with the ancestors. And when Senghor describes praying to masks, he's actually speaking to his ancestors and he's honoring them. He's not having a chat with inanimate bits of wood. And when men wear the masks, especially during masked dances, the masks actually represent spirits, gods, and or the ancestors. And they are regarded as embodying the ancestors. So that isn't a man with a mask dancing, it is the ancestor. So note, although the masks are very aesthetically pleasing and artistic, they aren't primarily artworks. They're sacred symbols, and they're seen as holy or sacred because they become the spirit or god or deity that is present in and through the mask. So they embody the divine, and when they're not being worn, they are actually kept in a sacred building or shrine that only specially initiated men may enter. If a woman enters the shrine, it's considered a major religious offense, and it's considered to be blasphemous. They would have violated and made that shrine unclean. And in some traditions, they would actually be killed as a result. So some other ideas. Africa has long been described in Europe as the dark continent, and over the years, African people have been seen and written about and talked about as savage, barbaric, uncivilized. And of course, it was these descriptions of Africans that were used to justify colonialism and slavery, because the argument was that African people weren't quite human, and they weren't capable of being fully adult or as educated or intelligent as Europeans, and therefore Europeans at the time thought it was totally acceptable to treat them like objects or animals. In fact, many slave owners had a register where their slaves were listed as objects. And later on in the poem, you will see how Senghor discusses some of the names that Europeans called Africans and how Africans were stereotyped and discriminated against. As I read the poem, look at the pictures and try to imagine that you're hearing Senghor praying to the masks that represent and embody his ancestors. Think about what he's asking the masks, and if this is a praise poem in which he praises Africa, or a protest poem in which he protests against injustice. Also remember that the poem has some characteristics of an elegy, because an elegy is written to praise and honor the legacy of a person or a people who have died. And the tone of an elegy is usually quite sorrowful, as the author reflects on a painful past and what they've lost. Remember that the poem can be any and all of these three. Also remember that poems are like music. They're meant to be heard. So listen very carefully to the way that the poem sounds when it is read out aloud. Listen to things like the rhythm, rhyme, alliteration. Is there any onomatopoeia? Is there assonance? And how does Senghor use sound to reinforce and emphasize what he is saying? And as I read it, please try and imagine that you are listening to a brilliant, passionate, Black African president who wrote this poem, not a middle-aged white teacher. Prayer to masks. Masks, oh masks, black mask, red mask, you black and white masks, rectangular masks through whom the spirit breathes, I greet you in silence. And you too, my lion-headed ancestor, you guard this place that is closed to any feminine laughter, to any mortal smile. You purify the air of eternity, here where I breathe the air of my fathers. Masks of maskless faces, free from dimples and wrinkles, you have composed this image, this my face, that bends over the altar of white paper. In the name of your image, listen to me. Now, while the Africa of despotism is dying, it is the agony of a pitiable princess, like that of Europe, to whom she is connected through the navel. Now fix your immobile eyes upon your children who've been called and who sacrificed their lives like the poor man his last garment, so that hereafter we may cry here at the rebirth of the world being the leaven that the white flower needs. For who else would teach rhythm to the world that has died of machines and cannons? For who else should ejaculate the cry of joy that arouses the dead and the wise in a new dawn? Say, who else could return the memory of life to men with a torn hope? They call us cottonheads and coffee men, oily men. They call us men of death. But we are the men of the dance, whose feet only gain power when they beat the hard soil. I'm now going to read through the poem a few lines at a time, and as I do so, I'm going to analyze those lines. It's a very good idea to take notes while I do so, and ideally you would have a copy of the poem in front of you, and you can take notes in pencil in your book, or if it's a printed out version, actually on the notes or on post-it notes. Use highlighters, use diagrams, do whatever works for you so that you can keep track of the various beautiful techniques that Senghor uses, as well as the themes and the ideas that he is discussing. Enjoy. Masks, oh masks, black mask, red mask, you black and white masks, rectangular masks through whom the spirit breathes, I greet you in silence. Senghor starts off by addressing the masks that he is praying to. Note the exclamation marks highlighting the depth of his feelings and the urgency of his tone in masks, oh masks. He also addresses a whole variety of masks, but says that the spirit, which is singular, rather than the spirits, plural, breathes through them. That's in the second line. This implies a unity of the ancestors in the afterlife. And it also highlights the fact that he's not praying to dead pieces of carved wood. He's speaking to spirits in the afterlife that are present in the masks. And note here that he's using paradox. Remember that a paradox is a statement that seems to be contradictory or logically impossible, but it actually tells a greater truth. So think about where and why the poet has used paradox. So for example, he talks about many masks, but there's one spirit. He talks about a greeting that is silent despite the exclamation marks, which imply a loud voice almost shouting. And how would anyone hear you if you're silent? So you can see how he's used paradox to highlight the fact that he's addressing supernatural beings. They don't obey the normal laws of nature. Also notice that the lines throughout the poem vary enormously in length, and that creates an uneven, unpredictable rhythm. So there's no rhyme, there's also no rhyme scheme, and you don't have a set number of syllables in each line. So the effect is of a conversation, or the poet writing down his thoughts as he has them. We call this free verse, and we call that process of writing down your thoughts as you think them stream of consciousness. So those are two technical terms that you might want to use in your exams: free verse and stream of consciousness writing. And you can also talk about an irregular rhythm and no regular rhyme scheme. And you too, my lion-headed ancestor, you guard this place that is closed to any feminine laughter, to any mortal smile. You purify the air of eternity, here where I breathe the air of my fathers. So in these lines, the poet greets an extra spirit or ancestor. He greets his lion-headed ancestor. And that description works on several levels. Firstly, masks were often carved to represent the features of animals. So if you have a look at that mask in the center, you can see that it is being carved to represent a lion. You can compare it to a lion's face. And literally, the poet is addressing the spirit that is present in the mask that is carved to resemble a lion. Also, remember that Senghor's clan totem animal was a lion. So a clan's totem animal is an animal that's regarded as being very worthy of respect to members of that clan. In fact, they're never allowed to hunt or even harm that animal. So by addressing his lion-headed ancestor, Senghor is talking to his most revered ancestor in his clan, the spirit most closely associated with his clan's lion totem. And of course, the lion is also the national symbol of Senegal, and it symbolizes strength and bravery, very important qualities for bringing about a change to the rest of the world, which is what Senghor discusses Africa doing at the end of the poem. And Senghor talks about how his ancestor guards the shrine where the masks are kept and the ancestors are honored. If you look at the picture on the left, there is one of those typical shrines. And he comments on the fact that this shrine is a sacred space that women are not allowed to enter, and where, because it's a sacred space, people must be very serious in the presence of the spirits. There's no laughter, there's no smiling. Remember that mortals are living people, that they can and will die. And he comments on how the spirits who are eternal, note there's a contrast there with mortal, it's the spirits that make the space holy. They purify the air, and it becomes the air of eternity, because this is where the spirits live, and it's the shrine where the masks are kept. And Senghor says he's in a space where he comes to breathe the air of his fathers. He's literally saying he's breathing the same air as his dead ancestors, although of course this is another paradox, because it isn't actually the same air, and also the dead don't breathe, but they are present in the air of this space. He's also highlighting that he is alive and mortal because he breathes air, which is a contrast to the spirits. And there's a play on the word air, because air can be spelled A-I-R, which means oxygen, what you breathe, or H-E-I-R, which means the person that is going to inherit from ancestors. So here Senghor is saying that he is breathing the air of his fathers. He has inherited from his fathers a particular role in the world of the living. And please notice that the implied audience of this poem is the spirits. It is the masks. It is the spirits and the masks that Senghor is speaking to. It is not us. We're a secondary audience. And it's almost like we are overhearing or eavesdropping on Senghor at prayer. And I suppose the invitation is there as Africans to participate in this prayer, to ask our ancestors for the same things that Senghor is asking his ancestors for, in the name of Africa. Masks of maskless faces, free from dimples and wrinkles, you have composed this image, this my face that bends over the altar of white paper. So, in these lines, the poet again uses paradox to highlight the supernatural. The faces in these lines are those of the spirits or ancestors, but spirits or ancestors actually don't have faces. They are faceless or maskless. They don't have physical bodies or a body that the living can see. So he's also playing on the other meaning of mask, which is a cover that disguises the real appearance of a person's face. We can talk about how one masks your feelings, for example. So in this way, the masks give the spirits a way of appearing, in inverted commas, in the world of the living. But they also disguise the greater truth, that the spirits have no physical being, that they are eternal, they cannot age. And that's why he says that the spirits and the masks are free from dimples and wrinkles, because that's how time marks its passing on our faces. And that's what people see when they look at the masks of our faces. Then he goes on to say that the ancestors have composed this image. Here, Senghor is commenting on how he was literally brought into being. He was created by a series of ancestors. He's literally their great, 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 however many greats you want to use, grandchild. And the word compose is another play on words because it means to create or make, but it often refers to an artwork. So you can compose a painting or a piece of music. An image is usually a picture, and here Senghor implies that his face or appearance are his ancestors' artwork. He is a picture of his ancestors. And when he bends over a piece of blank white paper to write this poem, and he describes the act of writing as bending over an altar, you need to remember that an altar is a table or a surface specifically that is designed for sacrifices to be made to gods or spirits. It is a holy place. If you look at the picture on the left, it's an African traditional religious altar. So by describing himself as bending over the altar of the page on which he writes the poem, Senghor is actually comparing the poem to a sacrifice or gift for his ancestors. And of course, this is a metaphor because he says that the one thing is the other, and it's a non-literal comparison. Okay, a piece of paper is not literally an altar. A white paper is also a formal document that explains a complex issue or problem, often drawn up by government. And you can see that the white paper is a good description of this whole poem. It's a white paper written to the ancestors or the spirits of Africa, in which Africa's complicated history and hopes for the future are explained and also prayed about. The next lines, in the name of your image, listen to me. Now, while the Africa of despotism is dying, it is the agony of a pitiable princess, like that of Europe, to whom she is connected through the navel. Okay, so in the name of your image, here Senghor could be referring to the mask as being his ancestor's image, or himself, because he said earlier that he is his ancestor's image. They composed him in their image. They composed him so that he is a version of them. Praying in the name of himself or the spirits is quite an ambiguous line. It can be understood in more than one way. That's what ambiguous means. And it implies that this is a very powerful and serious prayer. And here he emphasizes the seriousness by using the imperative voice of the mood of the verb. And all that means is that he issues a command, and he uses exclamation marks to make it sound really urgent when he says, listen to me. The reference to the Africa of despotism, and remember he wrote this poem in 1945, is a reference to Africa as it was at the time. Most of Africa was still colonized. It was ruled by despots, which are ruthless, greedy rulers or tyrants. And he was saying they had absolute control over Africa and Africans. In 1945, most of Africa, as I said, was colonized, and it was the beginning of revolutionary demands for change and for independence. So in these lines, Senghor says that this colonial past of tyranny and pain is dying. But there's a great deal of violence and pain in the change. And he describes Africa at the time, in 1945, as being in agony and as vulnerable and as helpless and as pitiable as a dying princess. And of course, Africa was generally seen from the European view, from a Eurocentric point of view, as weak or damaged and the object of pity. So he goes on to say that Europe was also at the time a place of despotism that was dying. And of course, he had had a front row seat on that because he had fought in World War II. He had lived through the horrors of a Nazi prison camp. And when he describes the connection between Africa and Europe as being through the navel, he's using the metaphor of a mother connected to a newborn baby through an umbilical cord. But this isn't a particularly happy or healthy mother-child relationship. He's actually highlighting how Europe and Western nations had exploited Africa for centuries through colonization. Because just as a baby in a womb cannot survive without nutrients from its mother, Senghor highlights how Europe prospered because of all the resources and people under slavery that European countries had sucked out of Africa. So think of all those resources that had been shipped out by slavers, merchants, explorers, and colonizers. Africa lost many of her people. Some historians say as many as a third of her adult population when they were enslaved. Africa lost gold, ivory, salt, spices, precious minerals, and all of these things were used to build the economies of the West and make them rich. African countries didn't see many of the benefits of Western so-called civilization. And in this interpretation, in the metaphor, Africa is the mother and the provider. Europe is the child, dependent on Africa. And of course, that's a complete inversion, which is just a posh way of saying turning upside down, of the traditional image of Africa and Africans being childlike, helpless, and dependent on Europe. You can also see Africa as the child in this metaphor and Europe as the mother. Senghor was arguing for African independence and was saying that the old dependent Africa was dying or coming to an end, and was ready for that umbilical cord of unhealthy dependence on the West to come to an end or be cut. Notice also how he uses alliteration. The harshness of despotism is linked to the horror of dying by alliterating that hard D sound, and pitiable and princess are linked by a softer P sound, highlighting how pathetic colonial Africa was in Senghor's eyes. Also notice that he uses two dashes. Please, they are not hyphens. Hyphens join words. They don't have spaces on either side of them. Those dashes enclose an explanation or a description of colonial Africa's metaphorical death. And remember that when you use two punctuation marks to enclose extra information, it's known as parenthesis. And it's sometimes done, not here, but it can be done with two commas or a pair of brackets. And these are all things that you could be asked in a test or an exam. You could be asked to comment on the punctuation. You could be asked to comment on the phonic devices, the sound devices. You could be asked to comment on the imagery, the metaphors, and you could be asked to comment on the theme or the message, which is mostly what I'm discussing. Now fix your immobile eyes upon your children who have been called and who sacrifice their lives like the poor man his last garment. In these lines, the poet continues his prayer to the masks, and you'll notice that he starts off with an imperative sentence where he speaks quite commandingly to the spirits, telling them to watch over Africa and her people. And again, his paradoxical description of these spirits highlights their supernatural powers. And if you think about the paradoxes, they've literally got immobile eyes, and those eyes are literally unseeing because they are just pictures of eyes or holes that represent eyes carved into wood. Logically, masks cannot choose what to focus on or fix on, but the paradox is that the spirits within the masks can. And Senghor creates the idea that the ancestors or forefathers are looking at him and the people of his generation and will watch over them or approve of their actions if they die in the process of trying to bring about change. And the word children implies that the living are far less powerful than the dead ancestors, and that the ancestors are in control and watch over the living. It also implies that the ancestors are like loving parents, and that the current generation is literally the offspring or the children that have descended from the ancestors. Having said that the old Africa of corruption and oppression must die, Senghor actually prays for the Africans that he knows are going to have to sacrifice their lives and will sacrifice their lives in order to bring about change. And just as a poor man, and you can see I've got a picture there of a man that's fairly disadvantaged, might only have one item of clothing, and so sacrificing his last garment is a huge sacrifice. Senghor says that Africans have very little to sacrifice, but they are willing, and they might have to give up the last and perhaps the only thing of value that they possess. Sometimes that is their very lives, in order to create a new and better world. So he's talking about the enormous cost and sacrifice of bringing about change in post-colonial Africa. The next two lines, so that hereafter we may cry here at the rebirth of the world, being the leaven that the white flour needs. So the word so at the start of these lines highlights that this is the reason that Africans might have to make that supreme sacrifice of their lives, not only to bring about the end of the Africa of despotism, which is the colonized, oppressed, exploited Africa that he saw when he looked around him in 1945. Senghor also explains that this is because Africa can actually help the rest of the world to be reborn, to be recreated, to transform into something new and better. And he uses the word hereafter, which is an archaic word. Remember that archaic language is language that is quite old-fashioned and is no longer used, and it's often quite biblical. And it just means, hereafter just means after this. And then Senghor uses the metaphor of Africa being yeast or leaven and Europe being white flour. And again, he's using biblical language and a biblical image, because he's implying that just as flour needs yeast in order to rise and make nourishing bread, Europe actually needs Africa in order to rise metaphorically or heal and become a better place. And of course, bread is a really ancient symbol of nourishment, life, and community. So Senghor implies that if Africa and Europe work together, and if Europe allows Africa to bring about positive change and improvement, together they can create something beautiful and positive, metaphorically something that is nourishing. And when Senghor describes Africans as crying here at the rebirth of the world, he's saying that Africa has to reject despotism, despite its history of suffering and oppression, so that when the world is ready to become a new and better place, Africa will be in a position to shout out that they can and will make the process happen. They will volunteer by shouting here. So Africans in these lines are described in heroic terms. They have the ability to save the world, which of course is a complete contrast to the usual Eurocentric stereotype of Africans needing the world to save them. And remember that a stereotype is an overly simplified way of seeing a whole group of people in one way, and it's usually a negative way. And it ignores how different the individuals in the group might be. And you can argue that stereotyping is the basis of racism, and a Eurocentric view of seeing everything European and white as better and linked to civilization, and everything African and black as worse and linked to barbarity, is a huge stereotype, and it is the basis of racism, and it was certainly the basis of colonialism and of slavery. Right, the next two lines, Senghor asks, for who else would teach rhythm to the world that has died of machines and cannons? So in these lines, he introduces an extended metaphor. Remember that an extended metaphor is just a metaphor that extends or continues through quite a few lines in a text. And here he links the rhythm, music, and dancing of African people to life. And if you are interested in seeing some of those sacred masked dances that he associates with life, just Google West African masked dances or put them into a search engine, and you can see how those dances look. Of course, you can also argue that the movement of machines and modern technology, think machinery to make cloth, think machine guns, think cannons, it's also often very rhythmical, but that movement is automatic, it's joyless, and it often results in death. And Senghor links the machines and cannons of the Western world to warfare and to death. So in this rhetorical question, Senghor asks, who else but Africans can teach the world the rhythms of life after the Western world has caused so much literal death and spiritual and moral death and destruction through machines and cannons? And of course, the machines and cannons he speaks of refers to the machines and cannons that were developed during the World Wars, and particularly during World War II. Think about the impact of aerial bombing, machine guns, tanks, nuclear bombs, planes dropping bombs. And there is a photo on the right of that nuclear mushroom cloud of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed 50,000 people in a matter of seconds. Remember that Senghor had experienced the horror of World War II and the supposed advances of Western, inverted commas, civilization for himself when he was locked into a Nazi concentration camp. You can also see this reference to machines as a reference to the Industrial Revolution. And of course, the Industrial Revolution made Western countries wealthy, and the resources for the Industrial Revolution came out of Africa and were at the expense of African labor and African resources. Think about the slaves working on cotton plantations. Think about the coal that was mined to drive all those engines. Think about the massive train lines that were built across Africa to take resources out of Africa. And then think of all the wars that have been fought as a result of and during colonization. Then he says, for who else should ejaculate the cry of joy that arouses the dead and the wise in a new dawn? Say, who else could return the memory of life to men with a torn hope? So the poet uses more rhetorical questions here, and he does this to highlight that Africans are the only logical and appropriate choice or answer for the people needed to create change and bring life to a world that has been destroyed by Western violence, warfare, technology, and the supposed benefits of Western civilization. He describes Africans again in heroic terms as having the power to bring the dead back to life and to restore hope to the hopeless. Comparing hope to a torn garment, that's a continuation of that earlier extended metaphor where he described Africans as being like a poor man willing to sacrifice his last garment. And he highlights how Africans may have to make huge sacrifices to create change. The poet implies that many people, primarily people in the West, have forgotten how to truly live, and Africans have the ability to remind them because they can remind them by giving back or returning to their memory of life. And notice that Senghor says that Africans should ejaculate a cry of joy, which is a really unusual word choice, posh name diction. Usually ejaculation, as you know, is the process of a man releasing sperm. It's associated with sex. It's associated with the starting of life and pregnancy. So the word highlights how life-giving this interaction with the ancestors that African men are responsible for actually is. And he's saying it's that interaction that creates a possibility of a new dawn or new life. Because remember, a new dawn is a symbol of new life, positive change, and was often used to describe life after independence or gaining one's freedom. And then notice also how the poet combines visual and auditory sensory imagery. So he describes what can be seen, which is visual imagery, and he describes what can be heard, which is auditory imagery. And by using all these different types of imagery throughout the poem, he makes his language really vivid and helps you to imagine what it is that he's describing. Then he goes on and he says, they call us cottonheads and coffee men, oily men. They call us men of death, but we are the men of the dance whose feet only gain power when they beat the hard soil. So here the author is commenting on how Africans have been oppressed and dehumanized for hundreds of years. And they were often not seen as individual people with feelings, but they were insulted about their appearance and reduced to a few elements of their appearance. Cotton Heads describes a stereotypical view of African hair. And if you think about coffee and oil, they're both dark colored, so it's a reference to African skin color. Or Africans were simply seen in terms of their labor and the products that they could produce for the West, such as cotton, coffee, and oil. And Africa and Africans were stereotypically associated by Westerners with violence and early death. You know, that whole idea of Africa being barbaric and savage. And therefore they were seen by the West as men of death. Also notice the poet's use of anaphora. Remember that anaphora is when you repeat the first few words of a line, and how this emphasizes the many negative names that Africans have been called over time. And then Senghor contrasts those really negative stereotypes of Africans, which are linked to the Westerners' view that they are associated with death. And he contrasts that with Africans' connections with the spirits, with ancestors, with their past, with their culture, all symbolized by the masked dancers. And he implies that it is these things that give Africans their ability to live fully, despite a painful history, despite enormous challenges. And he says that even though Africa has gone through all of this, Africans will actually restore life to a dying Western world and bring about a better future. He also implies that, ironically, Africans gain power through their connection with Africa, which is symbolized by the hard soil they dance on, and through the hardship that they have suffered. That's symbolized by how hard the ground is. And he says that that's only made Africans stronger and their contribution greater. And notice how he emphasizes this by alliterating that hard D sound in dance and death. And by juxtaposing these two words, you know, putting them next to each other so that the contrast is more obvious. And he's contrasting life and death, which is what the connotations of those words are. He's highlighting the huge difference between what Africa offers and the way that Africa is often seen. And he's actually highlighting that those are opposite things. So remember, juxtaposition is when an author puts opposites close together to highlight how different they are from each other. And connotations are what words suggest or imply, not just their dictionary literal meaning. So, for example, death is not just a neutral word meaning the end of life. It has connotations of fear and violence and sadness and terror and darkness and the unknown. Or it can be seen positively sometimes as an afterlife, as a link to the past, as a link to the spirits, as a link to the ancestors. But here, when he talks about men of death, he's talking about the Western connotations of the word as being incredibly negative. I thought it would be useful to you if I just briefly summarized what I see as the main message of the poem. And from my perspective, it's this: that despite negative Western stereotypes, Africa's great strength is her ancient connection to her ancestors, her history, her culture, and all of those things are represented or symbolized by the sacred masks. And he also says that the Western world has been corrupted and has lost its values of humanity and the ability to live a meaningful life. And he says that Africa will lead the world into a new and better future because Africa has retained her culture and her sense of what is sacred. And as long as Africa hangs on to that knowledge and hangs on to that respect, Africa can lead the world into a better future. And then I also thought I would just give you some useful vocabulary. I have explained what these words mean as we've gone through the presentation, so I'm not going to explain all of them again, but I'll just read them to you so that you know what the pronunciation is. You don't have to use these words when you write about the poem, but they are very useful. And I would suggest that if you don't know what any of them mean, look them up, write out the definition, and actually learn them. And some of these words will get you a top A, a distinction, if you use them in your answers, of course, provided you're actually answering the question. So the first ones are a Eurocentric view or Eurocentrism. So a combination of European and centered. So it's gazing at the world through European eyes. Then we have stereotype and stereotyping, despotism and despot, tyranny and tyrant, democracy, socialism, colonialism, negritude, and embodiment. Then useful vocabulary for discussing the structure of the poem, which you would generally do in a poetry essay, but you might get a 3-mark question where you could use any of these terms and they would be useful. So there is free verse, praise poem, protest poem, and you can also add elegy to that list. And those are different forms of poetry, and you can consider whether or not and to what extent this poem falls into those categories or forms. There's imperative sentences where a command is issued, exclamatory sentences or exclamations, and there is parenthesis. In this poem, parenthesis is accomplished by using dashes, but remember that it can also be accomplished by using pairs of commas or brackets. On the slide, I have listed for you the figures of speech that I discussed while I was analyzing this poem. Please note that these are not all of the figures of speech that Senghor has used, and there are probably many more in there, but these are the really important figures of speech that are used quite often in this poem and are used throughout the poems that have been prescribed for you in your matric syllabus. So if you know what these figures of speech are, if you can spell them, and what would be a real bonus is if you can use them yourself in your writing and your speaking, you will find that this is enormously beneficial knowledge for you. So I would advise that if you don't know what one of these figures of speech are and you are not quite sure of a definition, look it up, learn it, maybe write out your own example and make sure that you have a very clear understanding. Now, don't mix figures of speech up with parts of speech. Remember that figures of speech are language techniques that are used to make language more exciting, more interesting. Technically speaking, you can write or speak without using figures of speech, but then what you say is going to be quite boring. Parts of speech are the jobs that words do when they are used in a sentence or when they are used in the context of other words. And there are actually only 8 jobs that words can do. Part is an Old English word for role that somebody plays, as in you play a part in a play. And parts of speech, there are, as I said, only 8, and what a word's part of speech is determined by what job it is doing when it is used with other words. So your 8 parts of speech are nouns, pronouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, conjunctions, prepositions, and articles. And then if you're feeling really frisky, you can add interjections. Sometimes considered a part of speech, depends who you talk to. Those are words like oo, are, aibo, aish, etc. Okay, so back to the figures of speech. The ones that we've got here are paradox, inversion, ambiguity, irony, contrast and juxtaposition, connotation and implication, rhetorical questions, metaphors, extended metaphors, similes and symbolism, sensory imagery, anaphora and repetition, play on words, diction and tone, and archaic language. And then other useful vocabulary is phonic devices. Now, although phonic devices are technically figures of speech, they are ways to make language more interesting. They are usually asked by the WCED or the NSC not as figures of speech, but as phonic devices. Phonic means sound. So remember that a phonic device, coming from the Greek word phonos or sound, is a device where the poet or the author is trying to make good use of language to emphasize their point. And it's really important that when you talk about a phonic device, you don't just name it. So you don't just say, the poet alliterates dance and death. Or even, the poet starts dance and death with the same sound. Okay, yes, that's a definition of alliteration. It would be fabulous if you said that in grade 1 to 3, round of applause. But by the time you get to matric, you need to say some more. So you need to say what words are alliterated, what sound is created, and what the effect of the sound is. Why did the poet choose that particular sound? So, for example, the poet alliterates dance and death, and he's emphasizing a harsh D sound to emphasize the drumming noise of feet on hard earth and the harshness of death. And he also links the idea of death and dance by alliterating the two words. So you can see there, I said what the technique was, alliteration, where it was used, dance and death, and then I explained the effect. And that's what you need to do when you're commenting on any phonic device. So some big ones, there's rhyme, there's rhythm, and on behalf of Welsh, which is where rhyme and rhythm actually come from, they're horrible to spell, I apologize, but a good way to remember the spelling is rhythm. You can remember the acrostic, rhythm has your two hips moving, okay, and that spells R-H-Y-T-H-M, rhythm. And then rhyme is rhyme has you and me rhyming, okay. Alliteration, that's when you're repeating the initial consonant sounds of words. And I always remember that because it's spelt with a double L. So that's like Lazy Larry leaps. And then assonance is when you're repeating vowel sounds within words, like how, now, brown cow. And assonance sometimes, but doesn't always, result in rhyme. And then onomatopoeia is when you say a word that echoes the sound that you are trying to describe with that word. So that's like woof or meow or hiss or bang. What's interesting about onomatopoeia is that it varies from one culture to another. So in English, dogs go woof. In Russian, they go chaff chaff. And in Afrikaans, a hond blaf of chunk. And those are all onomatopoeic words for the sound that a dog makes. But it seems that depending on your culture, dogs make different noises. Apologies, I don't know what sound an isiXhosa dog makes. But that is what onomatopoeia is. And the way that I remember how to spell onomatopoeia, it's a horrible spelling, it also comes from ancient Greek, is on-o-mat-o-po-e-i-a. So loads of O's, and then right at the end you go E-I-A. And it's a word that uses just about every vowel in English except U. So good luck with that. Then this is a typical poetry essay question, and I suggest that in looking to try and answer it, look through your notes, find evidence that supports your opinion. And remember that you should be able to write a paragraph on the structure of the poem, a paragraph on the imagery of the poem, and a paragraph on the tone. This is a typical matric external exam question. They actually scaffolded for you. In the question, they're implying what your paragraph should be. Alternatively, you could address all three aspects in separate paragraphs on why Prayer to Masks is or is not a praise poem, a protest poem, or an elegy. And of course, you need to quote from the poem to support your arguments and make sure that your opinion and the reasons for that opinion are very, very clear. So you use the classic argument structure of a literature essay. It's just a shorter literature essay where you're using point, evidence, explanation. Make a point about the poem, quote from the poem or paraphrase, in other words, put it in your own words as evidence, and then explain how your evidence proves your point. And if you listen carefully to my presentation, a lot of the time I have been arguing. I would suggest that in preparing for your matric final exams, you just bullet point plan a couple of poetry essays. Don't write them out in full because you probably don't have time, but if you bullet point plan them, when you get into that exam, you will already have arguments in your head. And it's also a really good way to prepare for the contextual questions. So I hope you found that this discussion and presentation is useful, and I would like to thank you for your time. And just to say that I've created this YouTube channel so that any learner or teacher who's working with the South African NSC curriculum can have access to teaching and detailed learning materials for free. Because I know that many learners and teachers don't have access to resources, and this is how they can actually gain from that and not lose out. And if you would like to support me in producing these videos, you found them useful, please like and subscribe and pass the link on to any of your friends who would find it useful. You are also welcome to make a small donation to support this work. You really don't have to. As I said, I'm very happy for this to be a free resource for as many people to use as possible. And if you are going to make a donation, please just use the Pay Fast link, which is in the channel description, and I would be very grateful for that. So thank you. It's been a pleasure doing this presentation for you. Please remember, like, subscribe, share the link, share the love. If you know you've got friends that are struggling, please by all means just share this link so that they can also access this material. And then if there is anything you would like to ask, or you would like me to do presentations on anything else, my email address is there, and I will happily take queries and comments and feedback. Thank you very much. Good night or goodbye.